Hi, and welcome to our update chapter revealing the changes in how decision services work that have been introduced in recent editions. The updates in this chapter cover 22D, 22.3A, B, and C, although they were not all released at the same time. So you can consider this as simply bringing you up to date as of September 2023 with any new features that have been released since the last chapter. We're going to be looking at four things. Four things that have improved decision services quite considerably. The first one improves the performance of decision services in one particular instance. And the next two change and improve how you navigate and work with your decision service. And the final one introduces a new concept to how some data can be referenced in decision services. First of all, caching. So the idea of caching is for one specific context. If you have Oracle Policy Modeling projects that reference decision services to pull outcomes from the decision service, then you might have found that if you use the attributes that are being retrieved from the decision service in a test case, the time spent to execute the test case increases. This is entirely logical because a test case that calls a decision service reference needs to talk to the internet and go and execute the decision service in order to get the expected or actual value that you're going to see in your test case. So in order to provide a palliative to this, there's now a client-side decision service result caching feature. Basically, it means that when you run your test cases for the first time, it will cache the results of attributes that were output from decision services, and it will use that data in the cache until such times as it needs to refresh it because you've changed the definition of the decision service or you've changed the values in the test case. But if none of those change and you're simply rerunning the same tests with the same values, then it will use the cached values. This is stored locally on your PC, and I'll show you where in just a moment. It means that the first run of any test cases will be slower because it will be creating the cache, and then subsequent runs will significantly improve. And as a small test, 400 test cases previously took well over 180 seconds, but then the first run was 19 seconds and now is around about 10 seconds with the decision service result caching. So it basically means that in your Oracle Policy Modeling project, there's now another folder called the .cache folder, which will contain a JSON file for each of the referenced decision services. And we'll see what that looks like in just a moment. So each time you run your test cases, it will, if necessary, retrieve values from this cache file or these cache files rather than retrieving them from the internet. We'll see this in just a moment. The second item is an improvement to how we work with decision services in the web authoring interface. Specifically, we now have a whole bunch of extra options when working with tables. As you can see, we can add condition columns, result columns, which we already had, but now we can duplicate columns and we can delete columns. And incidentally, in case you're going to ask me, yes, you can also duplicate rows and you can delete rows much more easily. So it's just an addition of supplementary items in the ellipsis menu to help you do things more quickly with rule tables. Still on the same subject, a major change or a major enhancement is now when you're creating a decision service, you can create multiple documents. Just like in Oracle Policy Modeling, when you can create multiple Word or Excel documents, now you can create multiple documents for your decision services. These can have unique names, and the unique names will appear in the user interface. You can see in this screenshot that there's a little tab there that says rules. That's because the original document's called rules. If I was to select the second document, as you'll see in my demo, we would see second document as a header up there as well. The final point in this set of updates is the concept of an identifier column. So you'll see here that I have a table which infers records. So it's inferring proofs of identity. And you'll notice that as well, instead of the traditional green column, I have a blue column. And this is an identifier column. The identifiers need to be text strings. They can't be dynamic. They literally need to be unquoted text strings. And what that means is that I can then refer to them using that identifier in other rules. So you can see, for example, underneath the table, I have a rule that says the document required for the airport equals the proofs of identity : passport. So I'm using passport as a unique identifier. So that will return a reference to that particular record. Or I can use it in calculations, so the total acceptance criteria could be the acceptance value of passport plus the acceptance value of the utility invoice. So this would be a numerical calculation of 5 plus 4 equals 9. But I'm using these identifiers instead of using typical Oracle policy modeling methods to identify a record. So this assists us in a number of ways, not just in decision services, but also as it happens in flows. If you're getting into the new concept of next generation flows, we use this in some occasions when we want to create, for example, a list of values. But that's for another day and another subject. So we've seen 4 major enhancements: decision service caching, rule table enhancements, document navigation and creation, and named records. And we're now going to switch over and look at a demonstration of all of these. So in this demo, we're going to look at the 4 items we discussed in the presentation. To begin with, let's talk about caching. So the feature introduced recently is the ability for Oracle policy modeling to create a local cache of decision service information, which is used then whenever you run a test case. Because of course test cases, if they include attributes that are mapped to decision service outputs, would in theory require Oracle policy modeling to contact the decision service through the internet for each and every test case scenario, which can significantly slow down the time taken to execute test cases. Now what you'll find is that if you have a project which has at least one decision service reference in it and uses test cases, and those test cases reference attributes whose value is provided by the decision service, you will find in the folder for the project that there is now a subfolder called .cache, and in there, depending on how often or whether you've run your test cases already, you will see a JSON file which is used to store the cache data for a particular decision service. So this is the name of the decision service as it would be on the hub. So if I open up this test case, you can see that it references the age of the adult as an actual value. And the age of the adult is provided by a decision service output. So in order to obtain this value, normally Oracle policy modeling, or rather the project, would have to go and find the decision service on the hub and perform the necessary execution of the decision service to get the value. This takes time since it crosses the internet. So the cache file has the job of maintaining a local cache of results of decision service calls. So if you're looking at a test case file and this test case file hasn't changed and the input values haven't changed and the decision service hasn't changed, well then there's no real need to go to the internet to get this value, since if neither of the things I just mentioned have changed, this value will not change, so it can obtain the value from the local cache file. If we change either the input values or the decision service itself, a new version is created, for example, on the hub, then the cache can't be used, and then the call will be made to the decision service in the normal way for that particular test case scenario. So it's a way of optimizing not using the internet unless it's absolutely necessary to call the decision service. So you can see that this cache file has just been updated because I just executed the test case scenario with a new input value. So something had changed, so one of the rows in the cache file were changed. If I run it again, the cache file hasn't changed again because in this case the cache file was actually used rather than calling the internet. The second item we're going to look at in this demonstration concerns tables and some new features that have been added to enable rule authors to work more efficiently with tables. If we pop into a project, for example, we'll notice that now in the ellipsis menu we have not only the traditional add condition and add result column, but we also have duplicate column and delete column and a shortcut to select the entire table. We also have in the row ellipsis, we have rows above and below, duplicate row, select row, delete row, as well as select table. So these go together to make it an awful lot easier to work with tables. Simple changes, but they make a big difference. Still on the subject of working in decision services, the third feature that we're going to look at is the ability to now have multiple documents within a decision service. You can see, for example, at the moment that I have a little tab here which says rules. That's actually because this document is called rules. I can now change the name of a document and add some description. So when I open it, we'll see first document, but also I can go back to the project page, add a document, and now I can, complete with spelling mistakes, so let's change that. Let's go back and change this. As you can see, I can also edit, I can also delete a document if I need to. So now I have the ability to switch between the documents, create rules in both documents, and as we saw earlier in another video for another chapter, we also still have the navigation features so that when you're in a document, you can easily navigate between sections of the document that use one of the standard styles. So again, it's a simple idea, but it's a really, really useful one to be able to create many documents, just as you would have done in Oracle Policy Modeling, to facilitate mapping with source files, but also just facilitate readability and maintenance. So I'm going to go back to the project and I'm going to delete this. The final element that we're going to talk about today is a feature of tables again, but tables in a specific context. As you know, it is possible to use a table block in a decision service to infer instances of an object. So the proofs of identity is the beginning of a rule which will infer something, some rows. So in the same way that in Oracle Policy Modeling you might have an infer instance rule which would be expressed as a table so that you could infer instances of an entity through a table, this is pretty much the same idea. And in this particular case, you'll notice that over and above the traditional conclusion column and potential condition column that we might see in other tables, there's a new column type. So what this comes down to is there's a new column type in tables for inference rules. This column is known as the identifier column or the identity column. And in my case, you'll notice it's called the document type. The values in this column must be static text without quotes, by the way. So they can't be calculations, they can't be dynamic text, they can't be concatenations. They just have to be static text. Once that's defined, and of course this is a simple example, but you could have multiple conclusion columns here. Once they're defined, They are essentially named records. So if you look underneath, I have a rule that says the document required for the airport equals the proofs of identity : passport. So I can simply use that to identify this record, passport being the identifier. Similarly, I can use the same concept if I'm doing, for example, in this case, a rule to calculate a value. So this rule calculates a total value by adding up numbers that come from this column. So the proofs of identity, passport, the document acceptance value, so this would be the value of 5, plus the proofs of identity utility invoice, the document acceptance value, would be 4, so 5 plus 4 equals 9. And we can test that by going into live mode, and we can see it. And we can see here that this rule is an object rule which results in a reference to that record. So whilst the need for this might not appear immediately obvious, there are a couple of scenarios where already in decision services it can make it a lot easier. So you can still refer incidentally to the document type using the traditional method, so equals passport or driving license or library card, as well as using the : method. But for those of you who are struggling to find a use case, I encourage you also to look into flows, because flows use this method to create named values for the purposes of, for example, creating a list of values. So we can expect, I would imagine, this sort of thing to show up in decision services at some point. That's it for our 4 major topics in the latest updates to decision services as they become more mature and meet more business scenarios. See you next time.